So we are finally at the last section of this lecture. In this section, we'll talk about the urinary bladder and the urethra. We are still talking about the development of the urinary system. So this section has been further divided into development of the urinary bladder, the clinical correlates, and finally the complications of the development of the urethra. We'll see how the urinary bladder actually forms, what steps are taken in the human embryo to form the adult bladder. Then we'll see what happens if any of this step goes wrong, and we'll see how finally the adult urethra is formed in both the males as well as the females. So let's begin with the development of urinary bladder. So before getting into it, you must remember the cloaca was divided into two parts by urorectal septum. The this happened at about 4th to 7th week of development. So now the tip of the urorectal septum, it forms the pineal body. So a pineal body is formed by the tip of the urorectal septum that was dividing the cloaca into an anterior urogenital part and a posterior primitive rectum. So the cloacal membrane also divides into the anal membrane posteriorly, which is continuous with the rectal part, the primitive rectum, and the urogenital membrane, which is continuous with the urogenital part of the primitive urogenital septum and the primitive urogenitals part. Yeah. So now the mesonephric duct, this in green is the mesonephric duct. It is opening into the primitive urogenital sinus. So this is only the ventral part of the division. This is the site of the mesonephric duct is the site where this urorectal sinus is formed. Urorectal septum is being formed, and it is dividing this primitive cloaca into a ventral part, which is this the primitive urogenital sinus, and a posterior primitive rectum. So the mesonephric duct, it opens into the primitive urogenital sinus, and it divides the urogenital sinus into two parts. The upper part is known as the vesico-urethral canal, and the lower part is known as the definitive urogenital sinus. So the upper part of the vesico-urethral canal, it expands while the lower part remains narrow. So here you can see the upper part is expanding and the lower part, it remains narrow. So the upper expanded part, it forms the urinary bladder. However, the lower part from where the mesonephric duct was originating, it forms the primitive urethra. And these are the parts of the vesico-urethral canal. The vesico-urethral canal is formed by the division of this primitive urogenital sinus by opening of the mesonephric duct. This mesonephric duct divides it into a definitive urogenital sinus, which lies caudal to the opening, and cranial to the opening we have the vesico-urethral canal. So the upper part forms the urinary bladder. It is continuous with allantois at the apex. This is the allantois. This urinary bladder is initially continuous with allantois at the apex. However, with the passage of time, this allantois degenerates and forms a fibrous band with the urachus. It is known as the median umbilical ligament in the adult. So the lower part of the vesico-urethral canal, it forms the primitive urethra. So the lower part of the vesico-urethral canal, it can be seen. This is the lower part of the vesico-urethral. The upper part forms the urinary bladder. The lower part, it forms the urethra, primitive urethra. The parts of the mesonephric duct distal to the ureteric buds are absorbed into the vesico-urethral canal. So this is the ureteric bud. So the part distal, this part in green of the mesonephric duct, which lies distal to this ureteric bud, it is absorbed in this primitive urethra. So this is where the absorption has taken place. So this is expanding. This is the vesico-urethral canal, which is expanding. The upper part will form the bladder, yes, and the lower part is the primitive urethra, and this is the definitive urogenital sinus. So this is the urachus. Initially, this is urachus, and in adult, it has the median. It forms the median umbilical ligament. Now, this area has incorporated the distal part of the mesonephric duct, which lied distal to the urogenital, which lies ureteric bud, distal to the ureteric bud, which it has been incorporated within the primitive urethra into the wall of the vesico-urethral canal. So the mesonephric ducts and the ureters, they open separately. Since initially they were combined together, the ureteric bud was opening directly into the mesonephric duct, and the mesonephric duct was opening into the vesico-urethral canal. But since the vesico-urethral canal, it absorbs the distal portion, the portion of the mesonephric duct that lies distal to the this ureteric bud in red. This has been absorbed within the wall of the vesico-urethral canal, as a result of which the opening of the ureter and the mesonephric duct, it has now been separated, which can be seen in the figure here. So this is the opening of the ureter, and this is the opening of the mesonephric duct. So as the kidney ascends, now the kidney has to ascend to attain its normal thoracolumbar position. The opening of ureters, they move upward and laterally. So since the kidney is moving upward, the opening of the ureters also move upward, and they also move slightly laterally. So moving on. So this is what we were talking about, again from a different perspective. This in green is the mesonephric duct. This mesonephric duct gives off the ureteric bud. The portion distal to the mesonephric duct is actually absorbed within the vesico-urethral canal. So after absorption, the opening of both the ureters and the mesonephric ducts, there are separate openings for both of these. So now the kidney has to move upward. So due to the upward movement of the kidney, the opening of the ureter, it also moves upward as well as laterally. As a result of which a triangular area is formed on the posterior wall of the bladder. This area is known as the trigone of the bladder. So a triangular area on the dorsal wall of the vesico-urethral canal. So this is the dorsal wall of the vesico-urethral canal. It lies between the openings of the ureteric buds. These are the opening of the ureteric buds and the mesonephric duct. This is known as the trigone of the urinary bladder. So the mesonephric ducts and the ureteric buds, they have completely separate openings now. The first the openings are close together. Here you can see in this figure, these openings lie close together, but since the kidney has to ascend, the ascension of kidney causes the ureters to attain a more lateral as well as a slightly upward position, as a result of which a triangular trigone is formed. It is derived from absorption of the mesonephric duct. Here in the figure above, you can see the mesonephric duct distal to the opening of the ureteric bud is absorbed in the vesico-urethral canal. So now we'll talk about the development of various coats of the bladder. So the epithelial lining of the bladder, the innermost layer of the bladder, this is the epithelial lining. The epithelial lining of the bladder, it is endodermal in origin. So the endodermal lining of the vesico-urethral canal is responsible for the transitional epithelium that is present in the urinary bladder. So trigone of the bladder, it is formed from the mesoderm, which is derived from the absorbed part of the mesonephric duct. So in the region of trigone, the mesoderm contributes to the formation of endoderm and the other components and the coats of the bladder. And this mesoderm originates from the absorbed parts of the mesonephric duct. The muscular and the serous coats. This is the muscular coat of the bladder, the muscle lining the bladder, and finally the serous coat, the outer lining of the bladder. They are derived from the splanchnic intraembryonic mesoderm. So the epithelium of the vesico-urethral canal, it forms the epithelium of the bladder. In the area of trigone, the mesoderm is responsible for the formation of epithelium, and the muscular and the outer serous covering of the bladder is formed by the splanchnic intraembryonic mesoderm. So what are the developmental anomalies that may occur with the bladder? So we can have a urachal sinus. So what was urachus? Urachus was, I've told you before, what urachus actually was. Now, if the lumen persists in the upper part of the urachus, so urachus is actually a communication between the umbilical. It is actually the allantois. The allantois that was supposed to obliterate and form the median umbilical ligament. However, if the allantois does not obliterate, and if the lumen persists in the upper part of the urachus, this is the upper part of the urachus which lies close to the umbilicus. It is called a urachal sinus. The urachal sinus is an opening that is a pouch that is open at one end. So it is usually open at the site of umbilicus. So it forms a urachal sinus. Fistula, a urachal fistula. Again, urachus is the remnant of allantois. Fistula is a connection with both the ends open. So if the lumen, the entirety of it persists, entirety of the allantois, it persists throughout. This forms a urachal fistula, which is open at the bladder at one end and at the umbilicus at the other. So urine may discharge through this, through umbilicus in this case. And finally, we can have a urachal cyst. So if only a small part of the urachus, it persists. Here you can see a small part of the urachus persists. The urachus anterior and proximal and distal to it has been, the lumen of which has been obliterated. The secretory activity of the lining epithelium of the urachus might lead to the formation of a cystic dilatation, which may now be called a urachal cyst. So what happens? A small portion in between the entirety of the allantois, it retains its lumen. Now the glands within this small portion continue to secrete their contents, as a result of which these the glandular contents are collected and a cyst is formed, which is known as the urachal cyst. Moving on, we have extrophy of bladder. So extrophy of bladder is also known as ectopia vesicae. So in this, referring to the figure, you can see the bladder is actually protruding outwards from the anterior abdominal wall. So this is a defect of the anterior abdominal wall not being formed properly, as a result of which the anterior wall of the bladder is not formed and the posterior wall of the bladder is exposed to the exterior, and the ureteric orifices, as seen in the schematic figure, can be seen directly from the naked eye. So the lower median part of the anterior abdominal wall and the anterior wall of the urinary bladder is not formed, as a result of which the mucosal surface of the posterior abdominal wall as well as the ureteric orifices are exposed to the surface. So urine can be seen dribbling intermittently from these ureteric orifices. It occurs due to the lack of migration and proper formation of the mesodermal lateral folds in the embryo, which are responsible for the closure of the anterior abdominal wall. So moving on, we have now the development of the urethra. Development of the urethra will be taken up separately in males as well as females, but the figures would be there side by side for comparison. So, development of male urethra is intimately related to the development of the external genital organs. Now, the epithelium of the entire female urethra and most of the male urethra is derived from the urogenital sinus. So, epithelium of the urogenital sinus is responsible for the formation of epithelium of the adult urethra in males as well as the females. So now taking up the development of female urethra, the most of the female urethra develops from the narrow caudal part of the vesico-urethral canal. So, vesico-urethral canal was lying cranial to the opening of the mesonephric duct. This vesico-urethral canal had two parts. The upper expanded portion formed the urinary bladder, and the lower caudal part was responsible for the formation of urethra. So, the caudal part of this vesico-urethral canal is responsible for the formation of almost the entirety of female urethra. The exception is a small terminal part which is formed from the pelvic part of the definitive urogenital sinus. So the definitive urogenital sinus, it lied caudal to the opening of mesonephric duct. It had two parts. The phallic part and the pelvic part of the definitive urogenital sinus. This pelvic part of the definitive urogenital sinus is responsible for the formation of the small terminal part of the female urethra. So this is the female urethra. The phallic part forms the vestibule of the vagina. The phallic part of the urogenital sinus is responsible for the formation of vestibule of vagina, and the terminal portion of the urethra is formed by the definitive part of the urogenital sinus. So the phallic part here again, it is responsible for the formation of vestibule of the vagina, which is responsible for the formation of into which the urethra opens. So this is the female urethra. Now moving on, this female urethra corresponds to the prostatic part of the male urethra above the colliculus seminalis. So colliculus seminalis, above this portion, this female urethra, it corresponds to the male counterpart, as can be seen in the figure. So whole of the female urethra is endodermal in origin except its dorsal wall. The dorsal wall, that is mesodermal in origin. And why is that? Because it is formed by the absorption of the mesonephric ducts. So now we have development of the male urethra. So male urethra has been divided into three parts: the prostatic part, the membranous part, and the spongy part. So we have the prostatic part. This is the prostatic part. Then we have a small membranous part. This is the membranous part. And finally a spongy part. So let's see how the development takes place one by one. So the prostatic part, it lies above the opening of the ejaculatory ducts. So these are the openings, these in blue are the opening of the ejaculatory ducts, which were initially the opening of the mesonephric ducts. This the portion of the urethra that lies proximal to it is the prostatic part. It develops from the caudal portion part of the vesico-urethral canal. So the vesico-urethral canal, this is the region where this mesonephric duct opened into the vesico-urethral canal, and it transformed into the caudal part. It transformed into the prostatic part of the adult male urethra. The posterior wall of this part is derived from the absorbed mesonephric ducts. All right. So moving on, we have the membranous urethra. This is the membranous urethra. It is a small part which lies deep in the perineal pouch. It develops from the lower part of the definitive urogenital sinus. So it develops from the lower pelvic part of the definitive urogenital sinus. Moving on, we have the spongy part. So the spongy part of the urethra lies in the bulb, the bulbar part, and the shaft of the penis, the penile part. It has two subdivisions, the bulbar part and the penile part, which actually lies in the shaft or the substance of the penis. It is derived from the phallic part of the urogenital sinus. So the urogenital sinus, the phallic part of the urogenital sinus is responsible for the formation of the penile part of the the spongy part of the male urethra. Except the terminal part of the urethra, which lies in the glans penis, all of the urethra is endodermal in origin. The terminal part of the male urethra, which actually lies in the glans penis, is derived from the surface ectoderm. So development of the spongy part of the urethra is closely related to the external genital organs of the male reproductive system. So this is a comparison. This is actually the source of development of various parts of the male and the female urethra. In so the female urethra, it actually develops from the caudal part of the vesico-urethral canal. We've seen that. And as well as the pelvic part of the definitive urogenital sinus. So these are the two sources of development of the female urethra. However, the development of male urethra is slightly complicated. The prostatic part, which lies above the opening of the ejaculatory ducts, that has developed from the caudal part of the vesico-urethral canal. Then we have below the level of openings of the ejaculatory canals, that originates from the pelvic part of the definitive urogenital sinus. Then we have the membranous part of the urethra. It also originates from the pelvic part of the definitive urogenital sinus. The penile part originates from the phallic part of the definitive urogenital sinus, and the terminal part, which lies in the glans penis, it originates from the surface ectoderm. So in this section we talked about the development of the urinary bladder as well as male and female urethra. We saw how the urinary bladder was formed and how the various components of the mesonephric duct as well as the ureteric bud were incorporated to form the adult urinary bladder. We also saw how the endodermal, the connective tissue and the muscular component, and finally the serous elements of the outer coat of the urinary bladder were formed. We finally saw the development of the male and female urethra, as how they developed and what were the various parts of the male urethra. I hope you understood this lecture and enjoyed it. For further such lectures, keep watching sqadia.com.